Her finals. She's taking them next week, yeah. All right, so today what we really need to talk about mostly, so we definitely need to get through all the human development section, which we've gotten through most of it, but there's some other additional things that we need to talk about. So we talked about yesterday ovulation, we talked about the reproductive cycle, and then we started talking about, okay, if an egg after ovulation is fertilized, okay, it travels through the oviduct for about a week, along the way dividing through mitosis, starting to become differentiated cells, eventually making its way into the uterus, implanting into the wall of the uterus, which has been thickened and enriched with blood vessels, preparing for that implantation. Then the extra embryonic layers develop. The chorion forms the placenta and the amniotic sac, and the embryo starts to grow. The placenta forms, the umbilical cord forms, and then finishes its development inside of the uterus. So some factors related to pregnancy and childbirth is what we're going to be talking about today. So obviously twins sometimes form, and we know the different types of twins. There's fraternal twins or identical twins, and there are differences in how they come about. So fraternal twins are no more related really than any other brother and sister. Okay? Because they come from two separate eggs and two separate sperm cells, they could be boy-girl, they could be boy-boy or girl-girl. They may look similar, they may not. It just sort of depends on the random combining of chromosomes. But fraternal twins are no more closely related than any other brother or sister. They just have to be born at the same time. In fact, oftentimes, I have in 7th grade, I have a set of twins. I have one of the twins in class. And I always thought they were identical, but they're not. They're fraternal twins, but they look very similar. Just like, if you have a brother or sister, people may say, oh yeah, you look just like your brother did when he was your age, because brothers and sisters tend to look alike. But really, they're no more genetically similar than any other brothers and sisters. So in fraternal twins, sometimes the ovary will release 2 eggs. Sometimes each ovary release a single egg. If they both happen to get fertilized, they can both develop into an embryo and a fetus and be born. And that's fraternal twins. There are times also when, sometimes if a woman's taking fertility medication because she's having trouble getting pregnant, you have different medications you can take, hormones, which encourage the ovaries to release those eggs. But sometimes they work almost too well, and a woman may release 3 or 4 or 5 eggs each ovulation. And in that case, if they all get fertilized, obviously you can get triplets or quadruplets or other multiple births. Other times, if a woman has in vitro fertilization, like we talked about yesterday, they will often implant several embryos because oftentimes they all won't implant and start growing. But if they implant 4 embryos and they all do attach and start to grow, then she would become pregnant with four children. So it depends. But you could have natural twins. You could have natural triplets. I don't know many cases of anything beyond 3 happening without any of those other fertility treatments coming into play. Identical twins are produced in a different way. So identical twins come from the same sperm and egg cell, but during the process of cleavage, as that zygote is forming the initial embryonic stages, sometimes the embryo splits apart, and each of them begins growing into its own organism, its own embryo. In that case, both twins came from the same sperm cell, the same egg cell, therefore they have the same chromosomes. Therefore they're identical. They have to be boy-boy or girl-girl. They're going to have basically the exact same genes, the same DNA. Okay? So they're going to look identical to each other. Now this can happen at different stages. That's what this diagram is showing. This is not really things you need to know, but it's sort of interesting. So sometimes if the embryo splits in the morula stage, in one of those very early stages of days 1, 2, or 3, sometimes if it splits there, what you have is two sets of identical twins that have two different chorions, two different amniotic sacs, basically completely separate inside of the womb, both with their own self-sustaining placenta, umbilical cord, and amniotic sac. If it splits a little bit later, there may be one chorion, but two amniotic sacs. If it's later, during the 8 to 13 days, then it may just have one chorion and one amniotic sac, and both embryos are growing inside of the same amniotic sac inside the uterus. Okay? And at the very end stages, sometimes identical twins begin to form, but don't completely separate from each other, and that forms conjoined twins. Twins that are born joined together, connected, sharing like parts. Sometimes they share many of the same organs, sometimes they only share a smaller amount. If they share some smaller amounts of certain organs, they can often be separated. But if they share vital organs, if they only have one liver, one heart, then they often cannot be separated, have to live their lives conjoined. All right, so some other factors, birth control methods. So birth control methods are used to prevent pregnancy. Okay? Important thing to say is that not necessarily to prevent disease. So we'll talk a little bit in a couple slides about sexually transmitted diseases. And birth control can prevent pregnancy, but not those diseases. So some of the ways that humans have developed to prevent getting pregnant, abstention. So obviously, by not having sex, then can't become pregnant. So that's one of the only means of birth control that's 100% effective. If a person doesn't have sex, they cannot get pregnant. Other means, the rhythm method of birth control is one that is not generally very effective, but it's trying to time sex to not coincide with ovulation. So we know that there's a window of time in which a woman can become pregnant, during the time around when she's ovulating. Okay? And so sometimes couples that do not want to have children try to time when they have sex so it doesn't coincide with that ovulation, and hopefully the woman will not become pregnant. At the same time, the opposite is true. Sometimes when couples are trying to get pregnant and they want to have a child, they may try and time it to coincide with ovulation. And that's when often women might monitor their body temperature, because as we said the other day, it rises around the time of ovulation. They may use a urine test to figure out exactly when the woman is ovulating, so they can increase their chances of pregnancy. Hormonal methods of birth control, like we were just talking about, birth control pills are synthetic hormones. There's also other means of getting those hormones into the body. There are injections of hormones that last longer. There are implants of hormones that slowly release the hormones into the woman's blood over a longer period of time. So there's a whole series of different means of getting those hormonal methods of birth control. Barriers to pregnancy, things like condoms, which prevent sperm from getting to the egg cell, or a diaphragm, which goes into the woman's vagina, which prevents sperm cells from getting to the egg cells. It's another means of preventing pregnancy. There are chemicals that actually destroy sperm after sex so that they aren't able to fertilize the egg, things like gels. There are devices that get placed into a woman's uterus. These are sort of long-term means of birth control that prevent embryos from implanting. They're damaging to sperm cells, so again, those sperm cells cannot reach the egg to fertilize it. And then there are sort of permanent means of birth control. In a man, it's a vasectomy. It's cutting the vas deferens, so sperm's not able to get out of the man's body. In females, it's called tubal ligation. And it's the same idea, cutting the fallopian tubes so that eggs are not able to make their way into the uterus, sperm aren't able to make their way to the eggs. So these are all means of preventing pregnancy. And their effectiveness varies, okay? And this chart sort of shows that a little bit. You probably talked about this in health class. These are the most effective means towards the top. But like we said, only abstinence is really 100% effective. There are always chance that any of those other methods may fail and that woman could become pregnant. But some of the most are sterilization, that's a vasectomy or tubal ligation. They're almost 100% effective, but sometimes they're not 100%. There's a 0.5% chance that a tubal ligation in a woman is not effective. She could still become pregnant. Or 0.15 with a vasectomy. Those intrauterine devices are very effective. IUDs are called. Moving down, a little less effective, the diaphragm or hormone patch or the pill, injectable hormones, those things are in this category. And then, at the lower end of the effectiveness, condoms, spermicides, things like that. Trying to time sex to not coincide with ovulation. Those are less effective. So, if pregnancy woman does become pregnant, we have some terms that we use in terms of timing. So, prenatal is a word for the time before birth or even before pregnancy. So often a woman that wants to get pregnant will take something called prenatal vitamins. You may have heard of. These are vitamins that sort of have the proper nutrients to support when she does get pregnant. The very first stage of development is a zygote, a single cell, a fertilized egg cell. After that egg cell starts to divide, goes through several cleavages to form the embryo. We call it that up until about 8 weeks. From 0 to 8 weeks, we call it an embryo. After 8 weeks, we start to call it a fetus. Until the postnatal time, after it's born, then it's a living person, baby. The period of gestation in humans, the average is 40 weeks. 38 to 42 is what a doctor would consider sort of full term. Sometimes women give birth before 38 weeks. That's a preterm birth, premature. And obviously, the more premature the birth, the more difficulty there will be in the health of the baby that's born. So, at 37 weeks, there's really no major problems. 36, 35, and as we go earlier and earlier, we tend to get more issues with the health of the baby because organs have not fully developed. Especially one of the last organs to develop in the fetus is the lungs. Because when are the lungs needed?
After they're born.
Only after birth. They're never functioning the entire time that the fetus is growing. Never breathes. Doesn't need to breathe. It's getting oxygen through the placenta. So the lungs are one of the last organs to actually mature. And so when babies are born premature, often their lungs are not developed. And they may have to be put on a ventilator to breathe for them until their lungs can mature properly. After about 42 weeks, so if a woman's pregnant and it's been over 42 weeks, generally the doctor will then induce labor and not allow her to go much beyond 42 weeks. And they can do that with different hormones that they administer. Although the mother and the fetus don't share blood, substances in the mother's blood can be transferred across the placenta into the blood of the fetus. And that's why there are various types of compounds that can have negative effects on the fetus. Alcohol, drugs, chemicals from smoking, okay? Certain viruses, certain toxins can pass through the placental barrier and have negative effects on the child as it's born. So that's why when a woman becomes pregnant, the doctor will advise her to stop smoking, stop drinking, stop taking any drugs, and so forth, take proper vitamins, get proper nutrition to support the development of that fetus. Along the way, as a woman is pregnant, often she will have a sonogram. Sonogram uses sound waves. to get an image of what's inside of her uterus, of the baby. So here's a sonogram of a baby. This is what it sort of looks like. This is, a fetus. You can see obviously the cranium and the spine and so forth. They can see the parts of the heart. They can see if everything is developing normally. They can tell the correct age of the fetus. They can do a lot of different things using these sonograms, okay, or ultrasounds. Sometimes a woman may need an amniocentesis where they use a needle to withdraw amniotic fluid from the amnion. They would often do this to diagnose any possible chromosome abnormalities. You could tell if a fetus has Down syndrome or any other chromosome disorder by looking at the cells in the amniotic fluid. They're cells of the fetus, so they can use those. They can tell for certain if it's a male or female. It's not typically done, but it's sometimes done to ensure the health of the fetus. And they use ultrasound to be sure that they're not going to damage the fetus or poke the fetus with this needle. It's a pretty long needle, has to get in through the skin and the abdominal muscles, through the amniotic sac to withdraw some of that fluid. And about 10 to 20% of the times when a woman is pregnant, it may end in a miscarriage. And a miscarriage is fairly common, and it's when, for some reason, the embryo or the fetus does not survive independently. And that leads to it not being able to fully develop, and that pregnancy never finishes. And so often a woman will lose the embryo or the fetus in a miscarriage. So that is fairly common and something that affects many women. We look at how the embryo develops. This is showing you sort of the initial stages. This doesn't go all the way through full pregnancy. This is showing weeks of pregnancy. So here you have the first week or so are the different stages, 17 to 19 days. And obviously the embryo starts off as an undifferentiated mass of cells, but as time moves along, becomes more and more differentiated. It starts to look more and more humanish as we get to these later stages after 10 weeks or so, until we get to the fetal stages when most of the major limbs and so forth have formed and most organs have started development. During childbirth, we break that into labor and delivery. Labor is the initial stages when the uterus contracts. One of the first ways a woman knows if she's pregnant, she's towards the end of her pregnancy, one of the first ways she knows that she's going to be having the baby soon, what are some of the things that happen?
The amniotic sac breaks.
Yeah, that we might say some water breaks. And what that means is the amniotic sac that's inside holding the fetus, it ruptures at the very end of pregnancy. The amniotic sac breaks, and some of that amniotic fluid will leak out through the cervix, through the vagina. And that's when a woman says her water is broken. And generally after that happens, she'll be having the baby within 24 hours. The doctor wants her to have the child within 24 hours, because once the amniotic sac is ruptured, the barrier to infection is gone. And so there's a possibility of bacteria starting an infection that can harm the fetus. So they want her to have the child relatively soon after the amniotic sac breaks. And then also around the same time, she may start to get contractions. So contractions are when the uterus, which is basically a hollow muscle, contracts. And it starts off mild. A woman can usually feel it happening, but it may not be painful. They're spaced out, and they happen once every 15 or 20 minutes. But then as labor is moving along, these contractions, they get more intense. They start to get closer together. They go from 15 minutes to 12, 10, and start to get to, at the very end of labor, they're happening, every minute or so. And what's happening is the uterus is contracting. It's starting to move the fetus through, down into the cervix. The cervix needs to dilate, needs to sort of open up to about 10 centimeters to allow the fetus to be born. There's hormones that sort of control this in a woman's body, and there are hormones that a doctor can administer. With my first daughter, once we went to the hospital, the doctor gave my wife Pitocin. It's an artificial form of oxytocin, a hormone in the woman's body, which sort of speeds along labor, and so makes it happen a little more quickly. So it's one of the ways the doctor can induce labor. So that continues until the fetus is moved down into the cervix, is fully effaced. It's dilated enough to allow the fetus to be born. Okay, and then we get into the second stages, delivery stages. So in delivery, contractions continue, but also at that time, the woman has to physically volunteer. So the contractions are involuntary. The woman has no control over the uterine contractions in the first stages of labor. But once the time of delivery comes, to actually move the fetus through the cervix, through the vagina, that takes voluntary effort from the woman. She has to push and move that fetus out. Head first is the way the fetus usually will come out. It rotates halfway through to fit through the pelvis and fit through the cervix easily. And then eventually the baby is completely out of the uterus, born through the vagina, and then the placenta breaks off of the wall of the uterus, and the placenta is delivered afterwards. So the placenta comes out after the fetus, after the baby comes out. I have a friend that's a nurse, and during his first round in obstetrics, he was very young. He was like 19 when he started going to nursing school. So anyway, he was in his first time ever seeing a baby being born. Right? He's pretty young, so he was just learning. And he was there, and he was observing and watching, and so the woman had the baby, and everyone was happy. And then the doctor told the woman to keep pushing. And my friend, who didn't know much, said, "Oh my God, it's going to be twins." But it wasn't twins. It was, she just had to get the placenta out, and so he felt kind of stupid afterwards saying that. But the placenta comes out afterwards, and the umbilical cord is attached with it. Then they cut the umbilical cord, and then the baby needs to start living independently, breathing, nursing, to eat, and so forth. Sometimes birth is not, the process of labor and delivery is not moving along quickly enough. Sometimes there's the fetus may be in distress. It may not be getting enough oxygen. Its heart rate may be dropping. There are times when a doctor may decide we need to get this baby out more quickly to help with its health or help with the mother's health. And they may do a C-section, a cesarean section. So they do a C-section if vaginal birth is impossible or dangerous. Generally, vaginal births are the preferred way. There's less complications for the mother, less complications for the baby. There's a quicker recovery, and so forth. But if a vaginal birth is not possible, then they may do a C-section in which they make an incision in the lower abdomen, cut through the muscles of the abdomen, cut through the uterus, cut through the amniotic sac, and then remove the fetus through this incision in the mother's abdomen rather than having it be born vaginally. And then they have to obviously suture up all those areas, and they need some time to heal. So that's what a C-section is. Just quickly to go through, since we're talking about reproduction, some sexually transmitted diseases. You probably learned about all of these in health class, correct?
Yeah.
You guys all take health in 9th grade, or it's optional?
Oh wait, I mean I had the choice between like computer.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, so these are sexually transmitted diseases. Many types of diseases are transmitted sexually through bodily fluids or through physical contact. Things like, many of these are bacterial diseases, some are viral. So syphilis is a bacterial disease. Untreated, syphilis can lead to blindness, heart damage, brain damage, death, and so forth. And you can see these images are of the actual pathogen which causes the disease. Gonorrhea, another bacterial disease, can lead to infertility. A woman with gonorrhea can have ectopic pregnancies, which is when an embryo implant somewhere other than inside the uterus. Sometimes the embryo can implant inside of the fallopian tube, and that's a dangerous situation. It will have to be removed, otherwise it could risk the mother's, it could be fatal if a pregnancy goes through full term and it's not implanted into the proper part of the uterus. Herpes is caused by a virus and can be treated, but there's no cure for herpes. It's a viral infection. Chlamydia is caused by bacteria, can lead to inflammation in the pelvis, infertility, ectopic pregnancies. HIV, AIDS is another viral disease of the immune system. And for a long time, AIDS and HIV were considered untreatable, in that when this first became common in sort of the 1980s, it was often thought of as sort of a death sentence. If a person got HIV and AIDS, that there were no good treatments, and it was a disease that really affected a lot of people. And since then, we have developed much better medications and treatments. There's now antiviral medications, which can basically allow a person to live perfectly fine, even with the HIV virus, with the infection. So nowadays, it's vastly more treatable than it once was. Another important one, especially that you may have heard about recently, is HPV, human papillomavirus. HPV is a virus, and 75 to 80% of sexually active adults are infected with the HPV virus. It's very, very common. And it is important to understand because it is a virus that is responsible for about 70% of cervical cancers in women. So cervical cancer is a fairly type of cancer that women can develop. And most of the times it's due to this virus. It's because women have been infected by this HPV virus, and it drastically increases the chances of cervical cancer. And there's really no cure. It leads to genital warts, but the real problem is that it increases the chance of cervical cancer. However, scientists have recently developed a vaccine for HPV that probably most young women get. So you may have had, and young men now. So it started off being recommended for girls, around 12, 13 is when they initially get. Gardasil is the brand name of the vaccine. And it is a vaccine that prevents a person from getting infected with HPV. And so it can, scientists, doctors think it can drastically reduce the incidence of cervical cancer in women. Men also get this vaccine as well, because women can become infected by having sex with men that are infected. So if we reduce the infection in men, we also reduce the infection of women. So something you probably have heard about if you've been to the doctor lately, and it's an important vaccine as well. Just a table to sort of summarize a little bit about these STDs and how they're transmitted, and what the whether they can be cured, and what the mode of transmission is. Are any questions about any of that? All right, so that covers everything you need for your quiz that you're going to take home tonight. I'll give it to you now. That's your homework, is to complete this quiz.